Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from wherever you're joining us from today. My name's Sarah and I'm the Program and Event Manager at the Reactor in Sydney, Australia. Welcome to another Microsoft Reactor live stream event. I would like to introduce Microsoft's newest MVP, Jesse Loudon. Today he'll be speaking about flexing your security governance with Azure Policy as a code. So firstly, just a bit of background in regards to Jesse. So Jesse is a principal consultant at Lab 3, specializing in Microsoft Azure, DevOps and Infrastructure-as-Code initiatives. He has over 10 plus years experience in IT Pro, and Jesse is a continual learner, open source maintainer and contributor, collector of certificates, and a strong advocate for the Microsoft Azure community, having witnessed the natural evolution from private cloud to globally available public cloud. So today we'll be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes with 10 minutes for questions at the end. However, do send us your questions throughout and we'll try and answer as many as possible. And whichever platform you're using today, you can engage with us via the chat or the comment section, either on Learn TV or YouTube. We'll also share with you a link to our feedback survey. So if you have time to fill that out using the event code for today, that would be great. And there will be an on-demand version available straight after today's session. So without further ado, though, I'd like to hand the floor over to Jesse to begin. So I'll just bring up Jesse on the screen. So thanks, Jesse, and over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And hi, everyone. It's great to be speaking to you online and virtually today. Thank you, Sarah, for helping me set up this session. I really appreciate it. It's been absolute like roller coaster since November last year when I was accepted into the MVP program. And I would like to thank as well everyone in the community who've been really supportive. Really great support there for my advocacy for policy as code. So let me cut over to the slides. I want to keep this as informal as possible, but also moving because I realize we're a bit short on time as we are these days. So the session, as Sarah mentioned for today, is about flexing your security governance. Really, this is about a cloud sort of governance story. I've done this talk a few times in different flavors over the past 12 months or so. This is the latest iteration that you're seeing today. So a bit about me, as Sarah mentioned, I'm a principal consultant at Lab 3. They're a growing consultancy in Australia. We're also in New Zealand as well. And I'm also an MVP in Azure. So let me cut over to... There we go. So a bit about me, a little bit more than what Sarah explained already. So I started in Lab 3 in January 2021. So it's a bit over 12 months now. My background is actually in infrastructure. So if you know a bit about infrastructure, you'll know, all the kind of use cases and scenarios we deal with that. Sysadmin, pre-sales and consulting is also what I've generally been involved with since starting in tech about 10 years ago. So pre-2018, I can kind of say I've been involved with a lot of Active Directory, Exchange, VMware, and Citrix sort of technologies. After 2018 is when I really jumped into public cloud, Microsoft Azure, and these days I'm doing a lot of infrastructure as code. So delivery of that using DevOps principles, Git flow, all that good stuff. So that's me in the bottom right there. That's pretty much where I'm talking from now, my workstation. So you can see I have a very simple setup, not too fancy there, but it does the job. So today's session, I actually want to kick it off with mentioning this tweet by David O'Brien, who's an MVP in Azure and runs his startup, Argos Cloud. It's actually a security product, a SaaS security product. And he mentioned something recently on Twitter that kind of piqued my interest that I think is relevant to this session. And it's about us, you put a question out to the community, aside from putting RDP on the internet, which means, if you have an RDP session from a VM on the internet, what are the most common security misconfigurations that you might see people do in the cloud? And he mentioned he doesn't care what cloud you're using. So that kind of got me thinking, really, because I saw the responses to his tweet, and I was thinking, okay, there's some common things here that can definitely happen to your environment or to your customer, and perhaps Azure Policy is going to solve some of these problems, and perhaps we can use them. Perhaps we can use Azure Policy today in terms of what's already there, reusable artifacts, built-in policies. So what does that look like, and how can we use the policy as code methodology to make that happen, right? So that's really the session abstract for today. Going straight into what a common misconfiguration is, I've listed some things here around this sort of identity and access space. So these are things that were mentioned straight out of David's tweet. So things like role assignments with contributor rights when they're not needed. That's sometimes a common thing, depending on how strict your Azure Active Directory governance is. Admins without MFA enabled. I would hope that's not a thing, but I think it does happen. Guest accounts with owner and global administrator rights. You might not think that's a problem, but guest accounts are not actually managed by your tenants. So it is a bit of a security gap there, given that, because it's an invite from another tenant, you don't have any visibility into or any control over what's happening with that guest account. So if it has rights such as owner or global admin to your tenant and also to your Azure environment, that is something you'd probably want to look at again. And the last one there being a user administrator role. This is a role that's, it's kind of like, if you have this role for a service principal or a user account, it's sort of like God rights, because you can assign yourself so many different permissions, and you can assign permissions to other identities across the environment. So yeah, that's the context there. Looking at network now, there's some things here you may be familiar with on the network side. VNet integration. So you may have resources created in Azure with VNet integration, but the public access is still open. So you may not have, if the resource supports it, such as a SQL database file or something else like that, that may be wide open, even though the resource is VNet integrated and may have private endpoints. So that's something to consider. It's not completely obvious. You may think, okay, it is locked down, but and I don't need to configure any firewall on the resource because it's VNet integrated. But yeah, it's not always the case. So that can happen. And NSG is, of course, allowing for any-to-any source and destination. That is something I do see quite often in my day-to-day sort of consultancy. It can definitely be restricted in terms of blocking that through some sort of checks you do on the Infrastructure-as-Code side, and also from the Azure Policy side as well. So that's a good thing to know. Storage accounts, they're very common. I would say every customer has storage accounts in Azure. Blob containers in storage accounts with public access enabled. This is something you may not be aware of, but if that is by default enabled, I think it is when you create a storage account. If you click through the portal or something like that, that is a security risk, because it can expose your blob container that you create later on to public access without you even being aware of that. So that's a common misconfiguration. And of course, public IPs on domain controls. This is one thing that's, it may be controversial, because you may say a domain controller needs internet access, or it may need to receive some traffic from external. But I think best practice would be that your domain controller being that, sole identity provider on-prem or in the cloud if you're running domain controllers in Azure. This is something you want to restrict as well, and at least be aware of where public IPs have been assigned. Now, encryption as well. This is the last sort of slide of this theme. I wanted to mention it because so when you provision a disk, a managed disk within Azure, maybe it's attached to a virtual machine, it gets storage level encryption out of the box by provided by Microsoft. So that's at rest encryption, but you don't always provision with disk encryption within the operating system of where that disk is attached to, whether it's a Windows virtual machine or a Linux virtual machine. So this is something that can be looked over in terms of something that you can audit as well. And and manage compliance through Azure Policy. Databases lacking encryption is something as well that's quite common, I feel, and TLS 1.0 and 1.1. So those old TLS versions are being deprecated or have been deprecated already. If you have any resources in Azure that are using or have those old TLS versions enabled, that's a potential security risk, right? So it makes sense to want to audit for that and actually find out where that gap is. Now, I've covered the common misconfigurations, and I think now we can go into what are the under the hood within the policy engine. What are the the ways and the methods that it's using to actually look at the configuration of requests that come into Azure through the Azure Resource Manager. So this is really a why story of why Azure Policy can apply governance basically to your resource configuration as you're creating and updating resources in Azure. And maybe it's not you, maybe it's someone else in your team, and they're not aware of best practice security configuration, or they're not aware of your governance standards. So on the left here, you've got typical put get requests coming into Azure. This particular one is for a disk. So it's got the compute disk resource name there as a namespace, and it's referencing a certain API version. There's many of them, of course, throughout time. And I pulled out a little snippet here about the SKU of this disk, saying it's a premium LRS premium tier SKU. So this scenario is very common, I feel, where maybe you want to restrict certain disks to being a certain SKU, right? And we can do this with Azure Policy. And the way that Azure Policy manages this governance is by looking at the resource alias definition. So from the left, that request will come into the Azure Resource Manager. It will then, in step 2, will get the Azure Policy snippet will actually get evaluated as to what you are looking to do from a governance perspective. So here we've got a field. So that field is actually the alias for SKU name, which is a property that is within that put get request that's coming into Azure. And then the business rule or the logic that we're applying there in that policy snippet is saying the SKU name of the disk needs to be premium LRS to be evaluated under this policy. So because we have that, then in step 3, the resource alias definition, which exists for that alias and for that property, will then return the actual path to where that value will be, depending on whether the API is a 2016 API, a 2018, or a 2021 API. So that's typically the flow. And then the final step as well is going back to evaluate the put get request. This is something Azure Policy does in real time as you submit a request to the Azure Resource Manager. It's doing all this within milliseconds. And then finally as well, it's also applying a policy effect. So if the resource is within your policy evaluation scope per the policy snippet, and it can find that data to evaluate against, then it will look at what's the next step there, and that's the policy effect. By the way, there's also a QR code images that I've included on some of these slides. So if you're looking at this in the future, or if you have time now, you could actually scan that, and it will actually take you to Microsoft Docs, the relevant Microsoft Docs for this slide or other slides as well. Okay, so thinking about policy effects, so that step 5 that I mentioned in the previous slide, this is how it works generally in terms of order of evaluation. From the left-hand side, we'll have a put get request. Now, if in the policy effect in your policy definition, your effect is one of the top ones here, where it's disabled, modify, append, or deny, or audit, that gets evaluated during the request that comes in. So it's immediate, pretty much means it's immediate evaluation for those type of effects. Now, the exception to that immediate evaluation are these two effect types, which is audit if not exists, or the deploy if not exists. So the reason that is because some resources you create in Azure, they don't all come through in the single sort of JSON request. maybe there's multiple requests that come through. And if the policy definition has logic to say that I need to do an audit if not exists, evaluation of this resource to evaluate the compliance against my business rule, that may need to happen in a subsequent flow, not during the initial evaluation, because there's multiple resources to be evaluated, if that makes sense, or there's multiple JSON snippets to be evaluated. So audit it not exist is an after thing. It's not exactly immediate. And then there's deploy if not exist, which is, I want to deploy an ARM template to this non-compliant resource. It might be a metric alert, or it could be disk encryption, or some sort of setting that you want to deploy to your non-compliant resource. That typically happens 10 minutes after the initial resource is created. Now we can also have that time reduced by using a new property. Well, not new, but new as in 5-6 months ago. It's called evaluation delay. So if you include and configure that property within your policy definition, you can actually reduce that delay that happens when you're doing a deploy if not exists. And I think that also applies, that evaluation delay property also applies to audit if not exists as well. All right, so I wanted to include a quick demo of the setup I've been running to do policy as code. So I've shown you, what are some common misconfigurations with Azure Policy, or with Azure governance in a sense. So, disk encryption, identity and access management, and network security. Now, and I've taken you through sort of under the hood. Here's how some of the policy engine logic works in terms of flow and evaluation. Now, this demo, I'm looking to sort of highlight a few things here. Visual Studio Code as the IDE. I use this every day. You can use Visual Studio as well, I think, but I just found Visual Studio Code to be, I guess, the most lightweight tool that has everything I need. And basically I'll showcase some security governance using Azure Policy. Of course, I'm using Azure as a cloud environment where I've got resources deployed. Bicep is the infrastructure-as-code language. So I've been on the Bicep sort of hype train since about a year ago, I think. It's certainly gone through a lot of iterations. It's hopefully coming to a major release soon, but it's been really great. And I can show you some patterns there of how to use it. You don't have to use Bicep in your own deployment or management of Azure Policy as code. You can use other languages out there as well: Terraform, Pulumi, PowerShell. Bicep is what I'll show today, but just know that there are other options, of course. Source control GitHub. This is where I store most of my code, and I use GitHub Actions as well, which I can demonstrate as well for a CICD. All right, so let me switch over to Azure. So here we have my sort of demo test environment. I've got a number of assignments here already. We'll zoom in a bit. So the ones that I have a few assignments that are deployed automatically through my repo, the public repo that I have here. It's called Azure Policy as Code. It's a public repo that I've been managing for about 12 months or so. So a number of these assignments are already here in my demo tenant, but the ones that I've kind of done just for this presentation are tagged or have the name of Microsoft Reactor 2022 in the name. So I've got the Azure Security Benchmark, which is a very, very large managed list or grouping of policies by Microsoft. So I've actually assigned this to my demo tenant, which I'll show you quickly. This is a really quick way to basically get started with auditing governance across your entire Azure environment. So you don't really have to do much customization of this. You basically assign it, let it do the evaluation of your resources under the assignment scope, whether it's management group or subscription or tenant, and you can then have have a breakdown of what are the non-compliant resources in my environment and what sort of grouping does that align to, and maybe what framework, like security framework, does that also align to as well there. So that's the Azure Security Benchmark. And another initiative or policy set that I've assigned is this one called the Security Demo Assignment. So this contains a lot of, I would say about 30 different built-in policies and one custom policy. So the idea here is that you don't have to use an existing initiative or policy set that's built in. You can create your own one. And I've created my own here based on, the themes of misconfiguration that I saw out of David's tweet that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So we've got some policies here, such as, subnet should be associated with network security group. So this is an audit effect, and this is telling me that there's a total of 12 resources across my environment that are non-compliant against this policy. So that's an immediate flag to me that, okay, these subnets don't have a network security group. I should go do something about that. I've got another one here called audit role assignments. This is a custom policy I created a while back, and what it will actually do is that it actually looks at role assignments that are on resource groups. So depending on your organizational governance and what the standard is, you may want to lock that down to only having groups, Azure Active Directory groups assigned access, or service principals assigned access to your resource groups instead of users directly assigned to those resource groups. And this policy specifically looks for the latter, which is users assigned to those resource groups. So I actually, before this session, I actually assigned a number of users just to show you what it can do. So the non-compliance reason you can see on the screen here, it's looking at an alias called principal type under role assignments. And then because there's a matching user value for this role assignment, it's now flagged that this is a non-compliant resource. So then if I look at the actual resource there, it gives me an ID. So that's the resource, the ID. I can see here as well, the resource ID is my subscription, this resource group, and then I can then follow that flow all the way to, where is this misconfiguration? And it's pretty much an immediate flag of this is something that may cause an issue in the future, over permissive role assignments or non-standard to my governance policy. So another one here is storage accounts should restrict network access using virtual network rules. If you're not deploying or you're not managing storage accounts through Infrastructure-as-Code, you may be creating storage accounts which have public access, by default open and with no virtual network rules configured. So this is something that, it's quite important. Storage accounts can hold very, sensitive data, confidential data. So here I've got 3 storage accounts flagged as non-compliance, and I can actually go drill into, okay, here's the alias that's being evaluated. It's a network ACL default action. And here's the actual path of my JSON that's evaluated. The target value in the definition is deny, but the current value is allowed. And that's why this resource is coming up as non-compliant. So this Azure policy here, what you're seeing is really a dashboard where you can view compliance, you can audit, you can actually take actions as well. So you can create a remediation task or an exemption. It's basically your governance pane within Azure, and it's been around I think since I would say 2016. I may be wrong on that, but it's not 10 years old. I feel like it's only really come about, in terms of what it is now, very, very, within the last sort of 5 years or so. And it's really something I feel like it grows, in value the larger your environment becomes. So let's say, you have you have a tenancy with only maybe 1 or 2 subscriptions, yes, you can use Azure Policy. But if you manage a tenancy with 10, 50, 100 Azure subscriptions, can you imagine managing compliance over your resources that go into those environments without something like Azure Policy? You'd have to be very, very strict on what gets delivered through your delivery process, whether that's Terraform or Azure CLI, or you have to shift left basically your compliance using those security scanning tools or compliance tools, shifting left before you actually deploy something. But Azure Policy can manage all that, even at the provider end. When something is deployed into Azure, it will manage that compliance for you. So it's sort of like shifting right in a way, but yeah, just from a different perspective there. I feel like it's something, at scale. If you can use Azure Policy well, you can really cut down on the number of security misconfigurations or gaps that you have in your environment. So I've shown you a bit of what this looks like from an overview in the portal. Let me jump into how I actually deployed those policies. I'll zoom in a bit now. So in my Visual Studio Code workspace, I've got a file here that I created. Basically, I'll walk you through this. This is Bicep. Okay, so it's a single Bicep file that creates a few resources. And the first thing that we need to do within a Bicep file, especially for Azure Policy, is we need to set the target scope. So here I've set it to subscription, which means I'm deploying this policy into my subscription. There's other scopes as well. There's management group, tenant level as well that you can create the policy objects in. So here I've got an assignment. So I'm assigning if you remember, I have the Azure Security Benchmark that's assigned. So this is actually a built-in initiative managed by Microsoft. So they release updates to it according to their release cycle. They're constantly adding and removing definitions from this initiative. So it's a grouping of managed policies by Microsoft, and I'm just calling the built-in GUID there for it. And that's as simple as you like. It's 10 lines of Bicep there to actually deploy that to my subscription. And you can see here as well, you may not be familiar with this, but I have a non-compliance message passed in here. So this is something that you can customize yourself. This is basically what I'm doing is basically a blanket non-compliance message to say, if there's a resource or a user that gets denied by one of these policies in this assignment, this is the message that they will see within the API or within the portal, when they're doing something. And you can modify this. You can say contact this team or this email address, and that's just generic. But you can also do specific non-compliant messages per policy as well. So that's a good thing to note. And then here I've got an assignment very similar to one above, but it's actually using a built-in, it's not a built-in, but a custom initiative that I have further down the file here. So this is my customized initiative that I've used to basically bring in about 20 or 30 different built-in policies, which I'll go through now. So this is what a policy initiative looks like if you're customizing it within Bicep. So typically you'll have policy type set as custom. Hopefully you'll have a description there that's helpful. Metadata you can use as well, which is what I found really good to do things like tagging and version and control. You can assign a category to that as well. So within the portal, what that looks like, if I go to definitions here, within the policy portal, there's all these different categories. So because of within that code, I assigned my category to custom, I could then filter within the portal for only custom policies there, and I can directly see that just filtering from the portal because I've set that metadata within code. So you can use that to your advantage. Source, this key I passed in myself in terms of you can create any sort of key value you wanted. So if I created a key value here, say something new, just something like that. It can be completely random, but if it meets your use case, that's great. And then if I deploy that, you'll see that within the portal as well. So it's fairly free roam in terms of metadata. So if we look at these policy definitions, here's a typical block here where I've got a role assignment policy, and I'm setting a definition reference ID. You can also set parameters for each of these. So if your policy definition has, accepts inputs that may be changed between environments, you can define those as well. So I've got an example of that here, where I'm creating a definition within this initiative for managing network security groups to be onboarded to log analytics for enabling traffic analytics. And you can see I'm passing in different parameters to this initiative, and then that basically is setting those values as I create the initiative. And so that pattern flows on through the entire initiative. If you want to check this out as well, it's available through my GitHub. I think Sarah will provide a link to the blog post as well. There you go. So the blog post that I published yesterday actually has links to everything I'm talking about in this session. So if you want to have a look at this yourself, you can. What I wanted to show you is, now that I have this policy definition, I also have a role assignment at the end. So if your definitions do anything in terms of modify or append or deploy, you need to have a role assignment managed as code as well. Otherwise, your managed identity that gets created for the assignment won't have permission to actually do those effects, to make changes to your non-compliant resources. So here's my role assignment. It's a contributor role for the service principal, and that's a single role assignment using the managed identity of my policy assignment there, if that makes sense. So that's within my file. Now, if I go to my code README, because we made a change to metadata, see if I can open up terminal. I should already be authenticated here, but if I take this and just run it, so that's basically looking at I'm actually setting my account here because I have multiple subscriptions, but the deployment is a subscription deployment. So this is using Azure CLI to basically take my bicep file that I just showed you. It's passed in as a file argument here, setting the location to Australia East. And then after that, I'm running a policy state trigger scan. So that's on the subscription level as well, in my current context. And this will actually deploy everything that I've set out in this bicep file, because I wanted to show you, just because I made that change to metadata for the policy set definition, I wanted to see that change in the portal. Okay, so apparently that went through. If I then go back to the portal, look at initiatives, and look at my security governance demo, can I edit the initiative? So I can see it's got version. Let me try and refresh, because that went through. So I've got category custom, version 010, and type is custom, but I'm not seeing my something new metadata come through. So potentially that is actually restricted in terms of what you can actually see from the portal when you pass in metadata. But if I was actually to query that policy initiative, I could probably see the metadata just by querying it. If I go Azure Policy, Might be initiative or it might be policy set here. Azure policy set. Did I mean policy? No. All right, let me have a look at the ref. Oh, it's set definition. There we go. Azure policy set dash definition list. Azure policy set definition. Got that right. Is there a space in between? Azure policy set definition list. That did work. I just query custom ones. I can probably do it with a JMES pass string. Yeah, okay. I won't bore you with that. Something I can investigate later. But I didn't get an error when I passed in that metadata, which is good. So it was accepted, but it's not, yeah. So the takeaway there, it's not available within the portal for all metadata, but it will be attached to the, I think it will be attached to the initiative or the policy sets, which you can query through CLI or something like that. So that's typically, a bicep flow there where we have a definition created through bicep, and then we can deploy that through Azure CLI or PowerShell. And the easy thing about this is once you establish a pattern or something works like that, if you manage your policy as code using this methodology or something similar, you can pretty much just copy paste that into another file. So I've done that already for another file which deploys to a different environment. This time the target scope is a management group. So it has a higher target scope there instead of subscription, like what I was showing you before. And this target scope is basically, you can imagine that this may be your prod environment where you want to apply governance at scale instead of just targeting individual subscriptions. So you may have a management group with multiple subscriptions within. In my environment, my test environment, I have a management group called test and a management group called prod. I have no subscriptions under prod, but I have a management group called test, and one subscription is under there at the moment. But you may imagine you may have 10 or 20 subscriptions under that. And if you deploy your policy to that scope, every resource under that management group will get this governance compliance that you set out within your definitions. So that's pretty much what I've done. I've copied my subscription scope definition to a management scope file, and then when I deploy that, it's very similar, but within the Azure CLI commandlet, instead of sub, I'm changing that to MG for management, and I'm defining the management group name there as well. So if I was to run that, it will actually do the same thing that I did previously for subscription. It will run that against my my desired management group. So within the portal, because I ran this before, if I look at compliance and change to my test management group, you can see I've got the exact same assignments that were named previously for my subscription scope, but the scope is the test management group there. So that's pretty much how you can, take one pattern that you've proven at a lower level, do all your testing there, make sure it works, then duplicate that and roll that out at scale to higher levels there. So you can, save your time. You're building like, a reusable asset basically. And that's typically what I do as well with customers. I prove it in a small environment, very targeted. And then once that's gone through all the testing and development and maybe changing parameters and that kind of thing, then roll it out to something that's assigned at a very high level. So yeah, that's the very simple example there of deploying to subscription and management group. Let me show you a little bit about CICD. So within my repo, the public one, for policy as code, I have a number of actions here. So I'll just cover this quickly, but basically I'm running Terraform and Bicep from this repo. So I've got working examples there, but with Bicep, I have 3 different actions or workflows. The CI workflow, it basically that I have here, it basically runs on a schedule, I think. So sorry, no, it runs on push. So basically what it's doing is it's validating the Bicep language, and then it actually does a what if test against the different scopes. So I have my subscription scope, my management scope, and that what if test will just verify that the file, the Bicep files will go and deploy, but not actually deploy. It's just checking that something can be deployed. So that's my CI. It's very simple. I have a similar thing for pull requests. So if there's a pull request that gets submitted to this repo with a Bicep file within it, this pull request CI workflow will run against that. And my continuous deployment file, very similar to my CI file, but instead of doing a what if deployment for Bicep, it's actually doing the actual deployment. So it'll go through and run it end to end, similar to how I just did it through CLI in Visual Studio Code, but this does it within a public runner within GitHub Actions, and it will pass in the parameters that I say. And yeah, that if there's any failure there, I get it notified immediately because this is hooked up to my notification system. But this is typically what you can do to automate your policy as code workflows through GitHub as well. So as you're checking in code, you have these configured actions that will run to actually validate the code, maybe do some linting and testing, and then when you actually merge your code into the main branch, you have another action which actually deploys it, or maybe you have an approval gate in there, so you can actually you have to manually click approve before you can actually deploy it. And yeah, so that's typically end to end what a policy as code environment looks like. In terms of tooling, what you can do as well. There's other patterns I have available within that repo. So there is another pattern for which I'll mention quickly is you can actually bring in JSON. So you might have your policy definitions in pure JSON, which is what I'm showing on the screen now, and then as opposed to Bicep, and then within your Bicep file, you can load that JSON using a Bicep function called load text content. So that's one way you can manage your policy objects. Instead of writing them in Bicep, if that doesn't suit you, you can write them in JSON. So let me switch over from. Cool. So you should be seeing my slides again. So we've gone through pretty much every tool on this demo. Let me know if there's any questions at the end about any of it. And I'll now move on to the role-based access control. So if we think about operationalizing this in your environment, if you're just getting started with Azure Policy as Code, you probably want to have service principals, which actually manage the deployment. In my demo, I was running everything as my own, user account. But in production environment, in your customer or your organization, you want to take that away, like that permission to run everything away from the users. So you want to have service principals, which are have managed credentials and all that stored in the key vault, ideally. And these are the typical roles that you can assign to them, and that I've found through my experience. So your service principal typically has higher access than everything else, but has higher restrictions in terms of who has access to run a service principal and who has access to use that service principal for code deployment. So you can think of service principal as being at the top tier of what it can do, and then as we move lower, we go to policy developers. They have contributor access to different scopes there. Maybe it's subscription or management group. They're the ones who are actually developing the policies and getting them to work and testing them out after deployment, that kind of thing. They're fairly privileged users, so be careful who you assign contributor rights to. Policy users, they don't need contributor rights. They just need the resource policy contributor, which is typically, they need to be able to access Azure Policy, that portal I showed you before, and they need to be able to run remediation, which is, taking that policy and applying the modify effect or the deploy if not exist effect to any non-compliant resources. So they will have, a fairly high sort of assignment scope for that, but they will have fewer permissions, so they won't be able to change things within Azure other than within the policy, within the context of Azure Policy, if that makes sense. And then the policy readers, there are maybe, someone who doesn't get hands-on with managing Azure Policy, but they do need access to see what the compliance is, for instance, or they want to see whether a certain policy has been assigned to a certain resource group or management group. So that's the lower tier there. Now I've touched on a bit of CICD that I showed you with GitHub Actions. This is a DevOps model that you can refer to as well for a multi-tenant environment. So you may have more than one Active Directory tenant. Sometimes you may have a lot of Active Directory tenants, depending on if you're a service provider that you're managing. And you may want to roll out your policy as code at scale to those tenants. So typically what you should be doing is some sort of dev stage before you merge your code into the main branch if you're managing all this from one repo. And that dev stage can do an assignment to these scopes. So it can assign to the tenant for that non-production environment, that dev environment, or it can assign to management group or subscription group or the resource group. And then, if that's all good, it's been tested and verified that there's no problems post-deployment, then you do a pull request, you merge that in to your main branch and then deploy it out to your production. And very similar as well, if you have a single tenant, perhaps instead of deploying and assigning and testing things at a higher scale within your production environment, maybe you'll just have specific dev management groups within that single tenant, or dev subscriptions within that single tenant there. So it's a very similar pattern, very similar concept that you can apply to make sure that only the good verified code is going to be merged into your main branch within source control and then deployed out to production. It's worth mentioning as well, the ecosystem of Azure Policy is quite large and it's growing day by day. So on the left, I've got a table here of different places you may want to look up or you may be familiar with already. So there's Docs, of course, Microsoft Docs I visit very often. Basically the one place you can rely on for any documentation on how to use Azure Policy, what the effects are, how to troubleshoot as well. And yeah, it's really good guidance there. I recommend it. And then, there's official code repos that you can go to for, logging an issue or seeing examples of policies. There's different tooling that I've mentioned there as well. The Azure Policy extension for VS Code's good value. And languages, there's many languages, not just Bicep. There's also, Terraform, HashiCorp language, Pulumi as well can be used. And there's community links there. I feel like there's too many community links, so I just chosen a few there. AZ Advertiser is basically, where these stats come from that you can see on the screen. So it basically hooks into the API of any changes to do with resource definitions and role assignments and policy definitions. So it's basically a change, a way to keep up with change with everything that's happening on the Azure governance side. So good value there. And then a repo I created recently, which is basically awesome Azure policy, that's what I called it, is just it's an aggregated list of everything to do with, docs, code, videos, and examples and podcasts and books, anything to do with Azure policy. So you may want to check that out. And these stats are really interesting because it kind of highlights that how wide the scale is of what you can do with Azure policies. So at the moment, there's about 800 generally available policy definitions across 61 categories. So a category might be anything from tagging to encryption, to say monitoring, or virtual machines as a category as well. And the aliases that I touched on before, those resource aliases, they're growing day by day. So as new resources get released in Azure, and then the resource provider works with the policy team or the governance team to actually bring the aliases into general availability. These aliases are what you can use to craft your policies in a way that will apply the governance that you desire, or what's required from the business. That's how it's, the policy engine is really checking against those put and get requests that come into Azure to verify what the value is, and does that value match what you have set within your policy definition. So that number of aliases is I think a crazy amount. And namespaces as well. These are namespaces like Microsoft Compute, Microsoft Storage. That's a large number of namespaces. Basically means there's a lot of resource types covered there. And the network aliases, I wanted to highlight that in the last week as well, where the majority of aliases and the majority of things we can do with Azure policy, it seems to be centered around network. And that makes sense because a network is a lot of the times the first entry point into your environment. So, if you can control the network, most often you can stop a lot of threats from happening at the security front before they become an issue and before the potential data exposure there. Okay, so closing up here, your next steps, if you choose to dive into this, as I have over the past months and years, you can look into some of these things, basically ideas or prompts that may interest you. You can look at, what are the security gaps within your environment today? You can look at, enhancing your policy as code workflow with different stages. Like I showed you with GitHub Actions, you can have a stage for CI and a stage for CD, and really automate that as much as possible. So it takes away from, issues you may encounter or things that may be missed during your code development, your code merging with source control, and also ensures that policy code you're merging into your source control is of good quality there as well. You can look at implementing custom deny messages through your assignments. That's something I'm really interested in, because if you leave it default, whoever is getting denied, they tend to have to deep dive into why are they getting denied. And if they don't see any custom deny message, they tend to waste a lot of time and cycles there. So I think it's good value to think about what these custom deny messages should be if you're going that far to restrict actions or infrastructure configuration within your environment. Yeah, so this is some ideas if it's of interest to you, and that's pretty much a wrap for the session. And if you'd like, you can connect with me on any of these socials, and I'd be happy to have a chat if you have questions or just talk about Azure policy. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. I believe your camera might be frozen. If you just want to have a minute to play around with that, we've kind of got you frozen at the moment. But whilst you're kind of just adjusting the camera for the last couple of minutes for any questions that do come through, just a reminder to everyone, the additional resources from today's session can be found here. So that's got what Jesse has mentioned throughout his presentation is the GitHub blog. And the blog there, so you can visit that link. Also, here is the link to our upcoming Sydney events, so you can just head over to our meetup page to see anything that will be coming up in the future, and also a link to the survey here with the event code 15327. So if you do have some time, you can go fill that out. That would be great. And also, I believe I haven't added in here, but here is the link to the YouTube channel as well, our Reactor YouTube channel. So if there's anything that you missed from today's session, you can go on there straight away and you'll be able to see the on-demand version available. So we don't actually appear to have had any questions come through, Jesse. So I guess you've answered all questions throughout your presentation and demonstration. You're currently on mute at the moment trying to work your camera, but that's okay.
I'll just leave it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's okay. So thank you so much again, Jesse. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your afternoon, evening, or morning, and we'll see you next time for another Microsoft Reactor live stream event and episode from our Devs Down Under series. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.